the shadow in the suburbs. I never thought I'd be the guy posting on a forum like this. I'm an architect. I deal in blueprints, load-bearing walls, and cold, hard facts. When my wife and I bought the house in the suburbs of Seattle, it felt like we'd finally won. It was a 1950s split level, a bit outdated, but solid. The basement was the only part that felt off. It was damp, finished with that cheap, fake wood paneling that always seems to hide something. I decided to gut the whole thing myself, but why did I always feel a sudden chill the moment I stepped onto the bottom stair? It started small. I'd be down there with my crowbar tearing back the paneling, and I'd smell something metallic, like old copper or wet pennies. It would hit me for a few seconds and then vanish. I figured it was just old pipes reacting to the moisture. Then there were the sounds. Not the house settling, but the sound of something shifting behind the drywall when I wasn't moving. I'd stop my work, hold my breath, and listen to a faint, rhythmic scratching. Could there really be something living inside the very foundation of my home? By the second week, the paranoia started to set in. I was finding my tools moved. A hammer I left on the workbench would be on the floor across the room. A box of nails would be spilled in a perfect circle. I blamed it on the stress of the renovation, or maybe a localized earthquake. Seattle gets them sometimes. But then I found the door. It was hidden behind a massive built-in bookshelf that took me 3 hours to dismantle. It wasn't a door to a room, but a small heavy wooden hatch built into the concrete. What was the purpose of a locked hatch in a residential basement? I had to use a circular saw to get through the lock. When the wood finally gave way, the smell that rolled out wasn't dust. It was the smell of ozone, like the air right before a massive thunderstorm. I shone my work light into the opening. It was a crawl space, maybe 4 feet high, extending far into the backyard. It wasn't empty. The floor was covered in a thick layer of fine gray sand that looked like it had never been stepped on. If no one had been in here for decades, why were the walls covered in fresh, wet handprints? I crawled in, my heart hammering against my ribs. The handprints were small, almost like a child's, but the fingers were impossibly long, stretching nearly a foot across the stone. I followed them to the far corner where a small metal box sat. It looked like a generic firebox, the kind you buy at a hardware store. I opened it, expecting old deeds or jewelry. Instead, I found a stack of Polaroids, hundreds of them. My stomach turned as I realized every single photo was of me sleeping in my bed upstairs. How could someone take these from inside my locked bedroom? I flipped through them, my hands shaking. The dates on the back went back 3 years, long before we even bought this house. In every photo there was a faint peripheral flicker, a blur of gray shadows standing right by my pillow. I wasn't alone in those pictures, and I wasn't alone in the house now. I looked back at the sand on the floor of the crawl space, looking for my own knee prints. There were none. The sand remained perfectly smooth, despite me crawling across it. Was I even physically present in this space anymore? I scrambled out of the hatch, my breath coming in jagged gasps. I ran upstairs to find my wife, but she wasn't in the kitchen. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I checked the front door. It was deadbolted from the inside. I checked the windows, all locked. I called her name, but my voice felt thin, like it was being muffled by heavy curtains. I went into the living room and saw her sitting on the sofa facing away from me. Why wouldn't she turn around when I shouted her name so loudly? I walked around the sofa, but as I moved, she seemed to shift with me, her back always facing me. It was impossible. It was like a glitch in my vision. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but my hand passed through her like cold mist. She wasn't there. The whole room began to warp, the walls stretching upward like pulled taffy. I realized the smell of wet pennies was back so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat. If my wife wasn't here, then who had I been talking to all morning? I ran back to the basement, driven by a frantic need to close that hatch. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The bookshelf I had dismantled was back together, standing perfectly in front of the hidden door as if I had never touched it. My tools were gone. The basement was finished, the fake wood paneling pristine and unscratched. I looked out at my hands. They were covered in gray sand, but the room around me was a lie. How could the entire basement have repaired itself in a matter of minutes? I threw myself against the bookshelf, screaming, tearing at the wood with my bare fingernails. I heard a whisper then, coming from the other side of the wall. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was a vibration, a low-frequency hum that said my name over and over. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus? It sounded like it was coming from inside my own skull. I felt a cold spot form on the back of my neck, a sensation of icy fingers tracing my spine. If I couldn't get back into that crawl space, would I be trapped in this version of the house forever? I managed to tip the bookshelf over. It crashed to the floor, but there was no hatch behind it. Just solid, seamless concrete. The handprints were gone. The metal box was gone. I sat on the floor and put my head in my hands, sobbing. When I looked up, I saw a single Polaroid lying on the floor in front of me. It was fresh, the chemicals still developing. As the image cleared, I saw myself sitting on the basement floor crying. Standing directly behind me was a tall, featureless shadow with its hands hovering over my head. Why was it reaching for me now? I didn't wait. I grabbed my car keys and ran out the front door. I didn't stop until I was 3 towns away. I called my wife from a gas station, and she picked up on the first ring. She sounded confused, asking why I had left for work so early without saying goodbye. I told her we were moving. I told her I didn't care about the house or the money. She thinks I've had a breakdown, that the stress of the city finally got to me. But how do I explain the sand I keep finding in my shoes every morning? We live in an apartment now, 5th floor, no basement. I thought I was safe, but last night I woke up to that metallic smell again. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and my hand brushed against something cold and damp. I turned on the light and the room was empty. But when I checked my phone, there was a new notification. A photo had been airdropped to me from an unknown source. It was a picture of me taken from the ceiling sleeping. If I'm on the 5th floor, who is standing on the ceiling above my bed? I haven't slept in 48 hours. I've started seeing the flickers in the corners of my eyes during the day now. They aren't just shadows anymore. They're shapes, tall and thin, weaving through the crowds on the street. No one else sees them. They walk through people like they aren't even there, but they always stop when they see me. They point with those long, impossible fingers and whisper that same low hum. Marcus, Marcus. Are they inviting me back to a place that doesn't exist on any map? I went back to the house once, just to see. A new family had moved in, a young couple with a baby. I stood on the sidewalk watching them through the window. They looked happy. They looked safe. But then I saw the father walk toward the basement door, a crowbar in his hand and a look of determination on his face. I wanted to scream, to tell him to run, to leave the walls alone. But my voice wouldn't come. Why did I see a gray shadow standing in the window right behind the baby's crib? I walked away and I haven't been back. I spend my nights in brightly lit diners surrounded by people trying to drown out the humming in my ears. I've looked up the history of the land, the people who lived there before. There's nothing. No murders, no hauntings, no cults. Just a void in the record. It's like the house was built over a hole in reality, and I'm the only one who fell in. Is there anyone out there who has seen the gray sand? Or is this just the end of my mind? The 3 a.m. key. Moving to Richmond was supposed to be our fresh start. My husband David and I had spent years saving for a place that didn't share a wall with noisy neighbors or overlook a smog-filled alley. We found a stunning Victorian terrace house, high ceilings, original crown molding, and a heavy oak front door that looked like it could withstand a siege. It was perfect. The first few weeks were a dream, filled with the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. But why did our dog Cooper refuse to step foot into the hallway after sunset? It started on a Tuesday. We had been in the house for exactly 22 days. I'm a light sleeper, the kind of person who hears a faucet drip from 3 rooms away. At exactly 3 a.m., a sound cut through the silence of our bedroom. It was the distinct, heavy thunk of a deadbolt sliding back. Then, the metallic clack of the chain being unlatched. I nudged David, my heart hammering. We went downstairs together, but the hallway was empty and the front door was wide open to the cold London night. How could a deadbolt turn itself from the inside? David blamed it on me. He said I must have been sleepwalking, a side effect of the stress from the move. I wanted to believe him. I really did. I bought a second lock, a high-tech smart bolt that sent an alert to my phone whenever it was engaged. Wednesday night, the alert came. 3 a.m. I watched the live feed on my phone from the safety of our bed. The thumb turn on the door began to rotate slowly, agonizingly, as if gripped by invisible, steady fingers. There was no one in the frame. If no one was standing there, what was turning the lock? The atmosphere in the house shifted from historic to heavy. It felt like the air was getting thicker, harder to breathe. There was a faint, cloying smell that started to linger in the entryway, something like old incense mixed with wet earth. I scrubbed the floors with bleach, but the scent wouldn't budge. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, dark, peripheral flickers that vanished the moment I turned my head. Was I finally losing my grip on reality after so many sleepless nights? By Friday, the psychological toll was undeniable. David was becoming distant. Claiming he couldn't hear the locks anymore, even when the sound was loud enough to wake the neighbors. He'd stare at the front door for hours, his eyes glazed over, mumbling about the guest who needed to be let in. I tried to pull him away, but his skin felt unnaturally cold, like he'd been standing in a meat locker. I decided to set up a tripwire camera at the foot of the stairs. If something was in this house with us, why did it only want the door to be open? Saturday night was when the subtle horror ended. 3 a.m. I didn't wait for the phone alert. I sat at the top of the stairs, clutching a flashlight. The deadbolt slid back with more force this time, a violent, angry sound that echoed through the house. The door didn't just open, it was flung back against the interior wall. The cold air that rushed in carried that copper and earth smell, but 10 times stronger. My flashlight beam hit the entryway, and the light seemed to bend around a specific spot in the air. Why was the light refusing to illuminate the space right in front of the door? I saw it then. Not a monster, but a presence. A shimmer in the air, like heat rising from asphalt, but shaped roughly like a man. It wasn't solid, but it displaced the shadows. It stood in the doorway, neither coming in nor going out, just waiting. I felt a vibration in my teeth, a low-frequency hum that made my stomach churn. It felt ancient, a djinn that had been tethered to this plot of land long before the Victorian bricks were laid. If it was already inside the house, why did it need me to watch it unlock the path to the outside? I screamed for David, but he didn't come. I ran into our bedroom, and he was gone. The bed was made, perfectly flat, as if no one had ever lain there. I checked the bathroom, the guest room, the attic. Nothing. I went back to the stairs, and the presence was gone, but the door was still wide open. In the center of the hallway, lying on the rug, was David's wedding ring. It was crushed, flattened, as if a massive weight had stepped on it, yet the rug beneath it wasn't even indented. How could something weightless exert that much physical force? I found David in the basement an hour later. He was huddled in the crawl space, scratching symbols into the brickwork with his fingernails until they bled. He didn't recognize me. He kept whispering about the key and how it was disappointed that the house was too small. We left that night. We didn't even grab our suitcases. We stayed at a Premier Inn and called a surveyor the next morning. They found nothing wrong with the locks, no intruders, no evidence of a break-in. But if it was all in my head, why were there gray, dusty handprints on the inside of my car windows? We moved into a modern apartment in a different borough, but the dread followed us. David hasn't been the same. He wakes up every night at 3 a.m. and walks to the front door, standing there in silence for exactly 10 minutes before coming back to bed. He doesn't remember doing it. I've started putting a bowl of salt by the door, an old ward I read about on a forum, and every morning the salt is black as if it's been charred by fire. I keep thinking about that Victorian house. If the entity was looking for a new house, has it already moved into us? I've done research into the history of Richmond. Apparently, our house was built over an old burial site that predates the Roman occupation. The locals used to speak of the theopener, a spirit that was believed to bridge the gap between worlds. They used to bury iron keys in the foundations to keep it locked away. During our renovations, we had removed a rusted iron plate from the basement floor. I realize now that wasn't a repair, it was a seal. If I go back and put the plate back, will the things following me finally stay behind the door? The apartment feels colder today. I checked the smart lock logs, and even though David and I were both in the living room, the app says the door was unlocked and relocked 14 times between noon and 1 p.m. Cooper, our dog, won't stop growling at the empty space behind the sofa. The smell of wet earth is back, and it's coming from the air vents. I feel a presence standing right behind me as I type this, a cold pressure on my shoulder that feels like a heavy, invisible hand. Why am I so afraid to look at the reflection in my computer screen? I saw a flicker just now, not in the room, but in my own eyes. My pupils looked elongated in the glass. I'm starting to hear the humming again, that low vibration that feels like it's vibrating my very soul. I told David we need to move again, but he just smiled, a wide, flat smile that didn't reach his eyes, and told me that the opener is already happy here. He hasn't blinked in 20 minutes. I'm writing this as a warning. If you find a house in Richmond that feels too good to be true, check the basement. Is it worth your soul just to live in a beautiful place? I'm leaving the laptop now. David is standing by the door and he's holding the car keys. He says we're going back to the Victorian house to finish the ritual. I don't want to go, but my legs are moving on their own, a puppet on invisible strings. The air is filled with the sound of 1,000 locks turning at once. If you never hear from me again, know that the door wasn't opened for a person. It was opened for something that has been waiting for an invitation for 1,000 years. Will the next person who moves in hear my voice whispering from the elevator? David blamed it on me. He said I must have been sleepwalking, a side effect of the stress from the move. I wanted to believe him. I really did. I bought a second lock, a high-tech smart bolt that sent an alert to my phone whenever it was engaged. Wednesday night, the alert came. 3 a.m. I watched the live feed on my phone from the safety of our bed. The thumb turned on the door began to rotate slowly, agonizingly, as if gripped by invisible, steady fingers. There was no one in the frame. If no one was standing there, what was turning the lock? The atmosphere in the house shifted from historic to heavy. It felt like the air was getting thicker, harder to breathe. There was a faint, cloying smell that started to linger in the entryway, something like old incense mixed with wet earth. I scrubbed the floors with bleach, but the scent wouldn't budge. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, dark, peripheral flickers that vanished the moment I turned my head. Was I finally losing my grip on reality after so many sleepless nights? By Friday, the psychological toll was undeniable. David was becoming distant, claiming he couldn't hear the locks anymore, even when the sound was loud enough to wake the neighbors. He'd stare at the front door for hours, his eyes glazed over, mumbling about the guest who needed to be let in. I tried to pull him away, but his skin felt unnaturally cold, like he'd been standing in a meat locker. I decided to set up a tripwire camera at the foot of the stairs. If something was in this house with us, why did it only want the door to be open?